This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Tonight, Deborah hasn't, I think, spoken here before, but she was indicating a stalwart, I think, of the Socialist History Society, with whom recent times we've worked, I think, quite closely, and I hope we'll continue to do so. It's nice to have that sort of cross-pollination of socialist historical thought and ideas going on. You're going to talk about Charles Bradlaugh, one of Tottenham's most famous residents, although not, I think, a Spurs fan, because he died before. But there is still a...
Yeah, he liked going fishing. He was a fisher. He liked
in the
fishing.
league. There is a council block down by the Spurs grounds, which is named after him, which will no doubt be bulldozed by the new Labour Council before very long. His name does live on in North London. But I think we're going to talk about something slightly more central to matters than Charles Bradlaugh's residence in Tottenham today. So, Deborah, over to you.
Okay, I'm going to talk about a little bit more than Charles Bradlaugh, though he does come into it. Right. Anti-socialist working class radicalism, I think, has usually been either passed over as almost an anachristic, or it has been confused with mere non-socialist radicalism, as if it were not something in itself, but was just an ideological staging post on the way to socialism. Edward Aveling and Annie Besant's well-publicised transfer from radicalism to socialism has bolstered this staging post view. And though recently Louise Raw has undermined the traditional myth of Annie Besant as a militant trade unionist, let alone a socialist, there has been no understanding that immediately before Besant and Aveling's sudden appearance on the socialist stage, they were not just non-socialist radicals, but actual anti-socialist radicals. And that brought they brought their previous baggage with them into socialism. I'm not going to talk much about Edward Aveling here in this talk, but he did have some very strong radical ideas, which I think you'll find in his writings, which he still argued when he was with the socialists. This talk wants to look at actual anti-socialist rather than mere non-socialist radicalism, but it is not revisionist in the sense that there is an attempt to make heroes or heroines of any anti-socialist radicals. Charles Bradlaugh, George Odger, George Howell, John Baxter Langley, George Potter even, Annie Besant, Edward Aveling, William Randall Kramer, Henry Broadcast and Charles Fenwick. I begin with a point. I'm so sorry about this. Maybe it's better if you just cut that. I think I'm going to be all right now. Okay. I begin with a point I made in another talk which I gave at the Lewisham People Before Profit celebration on the 150th anniversary of the founding of the IWMA last September. I was told then by somebody who's in the room that the point wasn't worth making. But I disagreed then, and I disagree now. I think it's actually central. The point which I'm going to enlarge on concerns Marx's actual invitation to attend the meeting at St Martin's Hall on September the 28th, 1864, of what turned into the IWMA. We all know about the invitation because Marx told Engels about it in a letter written some 6 weeks later on November the 4th, 1864. Marx told Engels that the meeting to set up an international association of workers had been called by Odger, meaning George Odger, and Kramer, meaning William Randall Kramer. Now, interestingly, Marx felt it necessary to give Engels some basic details about the two men, which in itself is significant, as anyone really conversant with British, especially working class politics, would already know exactly who Odger and Kramer were, but he was possibly just reminding him. Marx correctly identified Odger as a shoemaker, and then almost described him correctly as the president of the council here of all the London trade unions. Odger was actually the secretary of the London Trades Council, serving for 10 years from 1862 to 1872, which gave him a very high profile in London working class politics, but was very far from being his only claim to fame. Like many radicals and advanced liberals, including several advanced liberal MPs, Odger was an active supporter of Italian and Polish nationalism, and despite his own atheism, he was a great admirer of Mazzini and, of course, an opponent of Napoleon III. And not too much should be read into Marx getting the name of Odger's position or the proper name of the London Trades Council, as Victorians were notoriously cavalier about such details, often calling the International Working Men's Association either the International, the Association, or the International Association, the International Society, with what used to be called gay abandon. And Marx also wrongly identifies something he calls the Trade Union Suffrage Agitation Society, which he goes on to say Odger was involved in with John Bright. Marx was right in thinking Odger was working with John Bright, but he's also working with other wealthy advanced liberal grandees who were all about to become, especially Samuel Morley, the part owner of the Daily News, they were all about to become involved in a project that in 1865 turned into the Reform League. Ostensibly, it initially campaigned for manhood suffrage, though this was watered down to an extension of the franchise to the better of artisans. As to Kramer, Marx was also on shaky ground as he mistakenly described him as a stonemason, though he was a carpenter. More importantly, Marx does not mention that Kramer had come to trade union prominence in the Builders' Strike in 1859, fighting for the 9-hour day. Odger would die in 1877 and never become a Liberal MP, but Kramer would become a Liberal MP in 1885, while his work for international arbitration would gain him the Nobel Peace Prize in 1903, and there are worse men perhaps than Kramer who've gained it since. Odger was the far more militant character than Kramer, and importantly for this discussion, Odger was a very good friend and an ally of Charles Bradlaugh. That's possibly Odger's most important friendship, apart from his friendship with Samuel Morley. Bradlaugh has disappeared from history, remembered only by his admirers, who, taking their knowledge of him from his own self-publicity, imagine he was a hero. Labour and socialist historians have really just ignored him. Yet from the 1860s through to the early 80s, Bradlaugh was the most prominent non-trade unionist radical anti-socialist in the country, with perhaps the exception of Annie Besant in the period 1874. After 1874 for a few years, when she was also very visible as Bradlaugh's second in command. Now, from the National Secular Society that he headed is worth talking about, and so is Bradlaugh's organisation. From 1863, the atheist Republican Malthusian Bradlaugh had his own weekly paper, the National Reformer. In September 1864, when the IWMA was set up, Bradlaugh only headed the London Secular Society, but from 1866 he was president of the National Secular Society, which was made up of most of the London and provincial secular societies, and it gave Bradlaugh a nationwide lecture circuit. While in 1868 he acquired a massive London HQ with a 1,000-seat auditorium in Old Street in London, called the Hall of Science, and on Sundays it offered 3 lectures, either by Bradlaugh or one of his allies, like Odger, and music. So that's 3 things that Bradlaugh had that Marx never had, which is a nationwide speaking circuit, this enormous headquarters in Old Street, and his own paper, a weekly paper, which he was kept going until 1891. And there's issues of Bradlaugh's funding, of course. As we all know, the IWMA never had its own paper, but had to depend on publicising its decisions through friendly newspapers. It had no nationwide lecture circuit and no great HQ in London with a 1,000-seat auditorium. It might be argued that the IWMA was a different kettle of fish and did not need such paraphernalia. I would argue that a weekly paper, a nationwide lecture circuit, and a vast HQ and auditorium would be useful to any organisation seeking to promote its ideas. However, they cost money, and this highlights what is too often overlooked in looking at the popularity and spread of ideas: funding. Bradlaugh had it. We shall see why later. Bradlaugh did not, as might be supposed, finance his operation out of ticket, paper or other publication sales, though of course they gave an income stream. Rather, the radical anti-socialist Bradlaugh attracted serious business funding. And while no one would deny that socialism also sometimes attracted maverick business support, never to the level of the business funding available to anti-socialist radicalism. I've gone into an awful lot of research on Bradlaugh's funding, but I won't bore you to death with it now. I sort of worked out what possible ticket sales and this, that and the other. But anyway, to go back to Marx's November the 4th, 1864 letter to Engels, Marx went on to describe how he was actually invited to the meeting, St. Martin's meeting. Importantly, he was not invited by Professor Edmund Beazley, the chair, who would later become something of a friend, nor by Odger or Kramer directly, but in Marx's words, a certain Lubis was sent to ask me if I would take part on behalf of the German workers, and especially if I would supply a German worker to speak at the meeting. I provided them with Icarius, who came off splendidly, and ditto was present myself as a mute figure on the platform. Marx clearly felt Engels would not have heard of Lubith either, as he describes him in some detail. He was, Marx said, a young Frenchman in his 30s who had never, however, grown up in Jersey and London, speaks English excellently, and is a very good intermediary between the French and English workers. Marx added that Lubith was a music teacher and gave French lessons for a living. Except for Lubith being French and having lived for a bit in Jersey, Marx was wrong. Lubith was a 40-year-old middle-class submarine engineer, was far too bourgeois and established in London to give French or music lessons. The confusion may have come about because Lubis had a very good singing voice, and as part of his political activism he organised small minstrel groups and choirs, or sometimes sang solo at big radical events, most often after 1868 at Bradlaugh's HQ, the Hall of Science in Old Street. A long-standing, very close ally of Bradlaugh's, Lubith not only organised the music for his big events, but he sat on the executive of the National Secular Society, and for many years he was treasurer of Bradlaugh's National Secular Society. Later in 1877, Lubith involved himself in Bradlaugh and Annie Besant's Malthusian League, which would really have been called the Neo-Malthusian League, as while Bradlaugh, Besant and Lubith accepted what they understood to be Malthus's view, that working-class poverty was caused by the overbreeding of working-class children, who then flooded the labour market. They did not like Malthus's suggested solution of celibacy and late marriage, and instead they advocated birth control. Bradlaugh, and even more so Besant, had been seen as progressive for their support of birth control. However, their anti-socialist Malthusian motivations really need to be borne in mind when assessing how progressive they actually were. But to return to Victor Lubith, the first question to be asked and answered is why on earth did the radical anti-socialist Malthusian Lubith go to Marx and ask him not only to recommend a German worker to speak at the St. Martin's meeting, but to come along himself if he wanted? The answer is simple enough. In September 1864, although Marx had been in exile in London for 15 years, he had not involved himself really in British working-class politics, and neither Lubith nor Bradlaugh nor Odger nor anybody else in their circles knew anything of Karl Marx's ideas. If they'd heard any whisper of Marx being a socialist, they imagined the top-down socialism of Robert Owen, which even Bradlaugh found so anodyne that he would still celebrate Owen's anniversary. But really, Bradlaugh and Lubith, Odger, etc. imagined Marx was simply another radical Republican 1848er, who, like themselves, opposed monarchy, aristocratic privilege and religion, who wanted land reform of an anti-aristocratic kind, manhood suffrage, some civil rights and education for girls as well as boys, and perhaps free secular education for the working classes. But all importantly, they had no problem with capitalism, apart from thinking it was not quite fair and meritocratic enough. It might seem strange that as late as 1864, Marx and his ideas were not known in London. But Marx did not often attend, let alone address public meetings. None of his works were in print and available in English, and as most exiled 1848ers were radical Republicans, it was really not that absurd to presume Marx was just one another. Now this is importantly. If Lubith and his allies had known Marx was a socialist, he would not have been approached and invited to the St. Martin's meeting, and it was very sensible of him to sit mute on the platform. His muteness allowed him to be invited onto the General Council as representative corresponding secretary for Germany, which in turn gave him a place on the subcommittee set up to write what might be called the IWMA's mission statement. Icarius, who had spoken but in confusing hyperbole, was invited too. The story of how Marx quickly used his position on the subcommittee, which soon met at his house, and that's very important, to wrest control of writing the preamble and regulations from Lubith and his most obvious allies, and doing it in such a shrewd way that Marx's version was accepted unanimously by the General Council, is too well known to need repeating. But what is worth emphasising is that while Lubith and his allies are generally described as Mansonistas, Fontana, Wolff, etc., each and every one of them was also an ally of Charles Bradlaugh. Marx moved as quickly as he now could to get rid of them, while getting his own supporters, including Frederick Lesner, who he managed to get on November 1864, onto the General Council. Lelubis did the same, but less effectively. Just 6 months after the St. Martin's meeting on April 4th, 1865, Lelubis actually resigned, along with several sympathisers. The issue of contention concerned France, and it can't detain us. But anyway, Lelubis had second thoughts and returned to the General Council. Now, Bradlaugh was not a member. Yet at the soirée held to celebrate the first anniversary of the IWMA, which Marx did not attend as he was in Manchester, as well as Odger and Kramer, Bradlaugh made a speech where, according to the National Reformer, Mr. Bradlaugh confessed that he'd been guilty of not taking out the card of IWMA membership till that very evening, but now that he was a member of the IWMA, he meant to work for the association. The General Council minutes of the IWMA are, as I'm sure you all know, very, very sparse. Details of important debates and quarrels are frequently omitted, with only a tantalising "a discussion took place," hinting there was any discord or disagreement. But despite their other failings, the minutes are generally scrupulous in recording the nomination and election of new members. I have found one other instance, but never mind. Yet at the General Council meeting held immediately after the soirée, when Marx was present, Bradlaugh's name is not even mentioned. Instead, there is a mysterious sentence. A discussion took place as to the late soirée. An explanation having been given, the subject was dropped. The method of how Bradlaugh failed to make good his claim to membership is not detailed anywhere, as far as I know, but Lesnar ascribed it to Marx, and this is Lesnar. I won't do his accent. It must be put down to the great credit of Marx that he did all he could to keep the dubious, self-seeking elements out of the International. In the early days, all sorts of ragtail, including the high priest of the atheists, Charles Bradlaugh, were milling around. And it was mainly thanks to Marx that such people were given to understand that the International Working Men's Association was no nursery for religious or other sectarianism. Getting rid of Matsonistas and keeping the bombastic Bradlaugh out of the General Council did not in itself deliver it over to Marx, as nearly all the British trade unions leaders who remained were also anti-socialist radicals. Marx set out to convert them. Arguably, he believed that was possible. Engels, I think you'll agree, always had more doubts from the very beginning. But then Marx is a much softer character than Engels in many ways. That's arguable. The first open ideological clash of the General Council between Marx and the anti-socialist radicals was the well-known debate in 1865 on wages and profits with fellow General Council member John Weston, the old Owenite, initially a carpenter but now an employer. Marx described him as amiable, which no doubt he was, but he was also, like Lassalle, a believer in Ricardo's iron law of wages. The usual take on the Weston-Marx debate is that Marx won it. Even the uber-conciliatory Randall Kramer thought so. But whether Marx convinced his actual audience or not, the debates were open to anyone, but no vote was taken at the end, few people not present at the debates were ever likely to know. As Marx's position was not actually published in English until Das Kapital appeared in 1887, and not in a separate pamphlet until 1898, that's 33 years later, as Value, Price and Profit. This was entirely Marx's fault, as the IWMA offered to publish it. Meanwhile, while it was impossible to get hold of anything written by Marx, Bradlaugh's radical anti-socialist pamphlets were readily available on his nationwide lecture circuit, at his Hall of Science, and at any radical bookshop, including Edward Trulove's at 256 High Holborn, for example. If you don't know him already, Edward Trulove will come back. I am emphasising this because I think we often forget that Marxist work just wasn't available. It was very, very difficult to be a Marxist in Britain unless you'd actually personally met Marx. After 1873, it was much easier to be a Marxist in Russia. And I have a theory about that as well, but I'll come to that. I'll come to my theories after I've told you my story. Anyway, without the written word to remind even those present at the Western Marx debate and who were convinced by Marx's arguments at the time, they could easily fade from the mind, especially as the contrary arguments were continually being advocated on the public platform and in pamphlet form. And it is clear that Weston himself was not convinced by Marx's arguments. Weston's actual views can be traced through the reports of meetings in Bradlaugh's National Reformer, which reveal him as close to Bradlaugh, though unlike Odger, not a clone. As well as continuing to believe in the iron law of wages, Weston would endlessly argue that along with the abolition of aristocratic entail and primogeniture, that the cultivation of waste lands was the solution to urban working class poverty. But where Bradlaugh advocated peasant proprietorship with the right to sell, which critics saw as inevitably creating free trade in land, Weston argued for land nationalisation, not for collective farming. Weston envisaged that the government would rent the land out in small lots, a sort of peasant proprietorship without the right of sale. Though Weston held these ideas, he sat with Marx on the General Council until 1872, which I believe was far longer than anyone who was not Marx's actual ally. Weston was always on good personal terms with Marx and would sometimes vote with him, but whether he actually understood what he was voting for or just thought Marx was a good bloke who couldn't help being foreign and having some funny ideas, we do not know. Further research may tell us. You may remember when I began this talk, I mentioned that Marx told Engels that Odger was working with John Bright in something he called the Trades Union Suffrage Agitation Society, which, while Bright would back out, would become the Reform League, which Marx initially saw as a General Council coup. He actually told Engels at the beginning of this is Marx telling Engels, the International Association has managed so to constitute the majority on the committee to set up the new Reform League that the whole leadership is in our hands. This turned out to be an incorrect assessment, and rather than the IWMA having the Reform League in its hands, the General Council members on the Reform League executive, nearly all of them anti-socialist radicals and trade unionists, would have been on the Reform League executive even if there had never been an IWMA, as they would all recognise radical and trade unionist leaders. And where Charles Bradlaugh had not managed to get himself onto the General Council of the IWMA, and in 1865 he was still a year away from setting up the NSS, National Secular Society, he had enough of a profile as president of the London Secular Society and editor of the National Reformer to get himself onto the executive of the Reform League. He also actually gets himself kicked off, and if you're interested, I'll tell you later in the in the Q&A, because it's quite interesting. It concerns Tom Brown's school days. That may remind you. At first glance, the Reform League appears to be a working class movement, albeit headed by a barrister, Edward Beales, and with some advanced Liberal MP members on its executive, including Thomas Hughes of the Thomas Brown school days. However, the Reform League was financed by the great Liberal Party, principally through Samuel Morley, who we know as a Nottingham-based manufacturer and one of the three owners of the mainstream Liberal Daily News. There were some other funders, all close allies of Gladstone, but Morley is the name to conjure with. They funded the Reform League because after some 20 years of indecisive election results, where the Tories and the Liberals were not really sort of getting the result, that they weren't forming majority governments, Gladstone had become convinced that the Liberal Party would get a majority if it extended the vote, not to all men, as the Reform League originally demanded, but to the better-off artisan class, as Gladstone was sure the Reform Leaguers would settle for a lesser deal than manhood suffrage. But Gladstone had a difficulty. While the advanced wing of his party, businessmen generally, borough MPs like Morley, Mandela, Stansfield, thought they could control a working-class electorate in the same way they controlled their working-class employees, many of the more aristocratic Whigs and their more patrician allies, called the Adalamites and headed by Robert Lowe, were utterly opposed to any extension of the franchise to even the better-off working classes. And so an extra-parliamentary radical campaign, initially making the ultra-demand of manhood suffrage, suited Gladstone's purposes. Far from being a working-class movement, the Reform League was a great Liberal Party ploy. And far from outraging Gladstone, even the famous Hyde Park riots of July 1866 were actually useful to him in defeating the elite Adalamite. That's it, I'm sorry, opposition. The Reform League only campaigned for 2 years. In its ultra-demand of manhood suffrage was not granted, merely extended better-off artisans. A single-issue campaign that is successful after just 2 years is clearly knocking at a very open door. Conspiracies don't work, of course, by telling every participant what's going on, though Marx and Engels were soon to spot Samuel Morley. Engels described him as a London millionaire who does not mind spending a couple of £1,000 in order, on the one hand, to be able to act as the commanding general of his sham Labour General Staff, and on the other, with its assistance, to let himself be hailed by the masses as a friend of Labour out of gratitude for his duping the workers. There is more of Samuel Morley to come. Ironically, it was the minority Tory government of Derby which actually passed the Second Reform Act as Disraeli, Tory leader in the Commons, had become convinced that Gladstone was wrong, and the newly enfranchised working class would not necessarily vote Liberal. In the short term, Disraeli was proved wrong, not least because of Samuel Morley. But where Marx and Engels had wanted manhood suffrage as a prerequisite to setting up an independent working class or Labour Party, and Gladstone had wanted limited working class suffrage to boost the Liberal vote, Samuel Morley now moved all his resources into making Gladstone rather than Marx and Engels' political dream come true. And as Engels had noted, Morley had considerable funding. He left £500,000 when he died in 1888, Morley, a time when an artisan could support a family on £2 a week. He was a very, very rich man. Samuel Morley set about convincing the leading anti-socialist radicals, all of them Reform League executive members, and some of them still on the General Council, that not only would the working class be best served by voting Liberal, as Gladstone would consider all reasonable working class claims, but they personally would be best served because they could stand as official Liberal Party candidates. Morley promised to find them seats. Not only that, but George Howell was actually put on Morley's payroll as a full-time organiser, and he sent out workers to constituencies drumming up working class support for the Liberals, while Morley was to find a handful of Reform Leaguers, Howell or Kremer, safe Liberal seats, and stand with official Liberal Party backing, calling themselves Lib Lambs. That's actually what actually happened there. Not in 1868, not one of them did get a seat, and each of them has a complicated story. Howell kept his side of the bargain, and he actually did very well out of it financially, personally. Before he started working for Morley in 1867, Howell had £6 in his bank account. After the general election of December 1868, just 18 months later, Howell had £650 in his bank account. That's however, and he went into house speculation. However, Morley did not keep his side of the bargain. Not one working class anti-socialist radical leader got a safe seat, and those stories have to be told elsewhere. All that needs to be said here is that the total failure of any working class radical to win a seat in 1868 did not end their alliance with Morley and the Liberal Party. The anti-socialist radical working class leaders continued to work for the Liberal Party, convincing the working classes to vote Liberal, and a handful of them, including Kramer and Howell, became Liberal MPs eventually. Marx and Engels described the whole lot of them as being bought by Morley. I mean, you may remember he made that he said that at the Hague Congress, and everybody got very cross. But arguably not at the sacrifice of their principles. As anti-socialists, they actually believed in class collaboration. And they not only believed that an independent working class party was a pipe dream, but quite genuinely that their own and their class interests would be best served by continuing their alliance with Gladstone's Liberal Party. That's debatable. Obviously, they let themselves be convinced of that. And Samuel Morley, of course, though, was not behind in getting ways to reinforce this comfortable thinking. Marx now had Das Kapital published in German, but as we've seen, he hadn't managed to get anything else printed in English pamphlet form. In contrast, Morley now added the Beehive to his newspaper portfolio. I would say also, the landlord of 18 Greek Street was a mate of Morley's, incidentally, and I don't know if you remember from the minutes, in 1866 and 1867, they were having trouble with the landlord, and he was opening their letters. And lo and behold, it was a mate of Morley's. As co-owner of the high circulation Liberal paper, the Daily News, Morley understood the importance of access to the media. And well before the first general election after the Second Reform Act, Morley had set about denying the oxygen of publicity to what he recognised as the anti-Liberal Party Marx faction on the IWMA. After the death of Peter Fox, I've cut him out, editor of the Commonwealth, initially Workman's Advocate, George Potter's Beehive, as we all know, gave the best coverage of Marxist positions on the IWMA. But Potter, who also promoted a militant rather than a friendly society trade unionism, was inevitably in financial difficulty, and in the summer of 1868 Morley took control of the Beehive. Marx and Engels were, of course, appalled. It is really a disgrace that after nearly 40 years of political workers' movement in England, said Engels, the only workers' paper in existence can be bought up by a bourgeois like Samuel Morley. The only workers' paper in existence being the operative sentence. Marx and Engels may have been appalled, but they were also powerless, as Morley quickly used his position to change the Beehive's editorial policy towards moderation. Shrewdly, Morley did not actually refuse to publish IWMA reports. More cleverly, they were edited, so that Marx's positions were either elided or made incoherent. Marx and Engels remained incandescent. The Beehive still calls itself a workers' paper, though it is really the organ of the renegades sold to Sam Morley and Company. Still, it took some time for the General Council of the IWMA to come round to Marx and Engels' view and vote against continuing submitting its reports, only to be mutilated to Morley's The Beehive, though eventually, and the citizen Marx proposed the General Council, blah, blah, and they... it wasn't until 1871, I don't think, that they finally agreed not to send reports to it. I'm not going to do that long quote because perhaps we're running out of time. I'm on page 11, just to give you hope. There's 25. With the Beehive in Morley's hands, the only paper left regularly reporting IWMA activities with any accuracy or sympathy towards Marx was the Eastern Post, a Hackney paper known locally as the Shoreditch Alligator.
There's a lot of them down in Shoreditch.
Yes. Why it's called the Shoreditch Alligator. I'd love someone to tell me why it's called the Shoreditch Alligator. But its pages were as open to Bradlaugh as they were to Marx, and so when Marx had his great public row with Bradlaugh over the civil war in France during the winter of 1871 to 1872, where Bradlaugh attacked Marx, calling him confusingly an agent of Bismarck and Napoleon III on the public platform, and in the National Reformer and Eastern Post, Marx could only counter Bradlaugh in the Eastern Post. It was an unequal fight, but we'll come to that in a minute. By 1870, most of the big-name British radicals and trade unions had drifted away from the IWMA. They were all anti-socialist, and while Marx might win arguments, they had remained unconverted. Marx had allies on the General Council, but in Britain they were less well-known men. Whenever the defection of the big names was brought up, Marx would strenuously deny it, and most Marxists have accepted Marx's denial at face value. But he was being tactical. The IWMA minute books reveal the exodus. In Britain, the IWMA was outside the mainstream, but was by 1869 outside the mainstream of working class politics. However, it had other functions. I mean, obviously the international function, and Marx very much wanted to keep it going. Then came the Franco-Prussian War. And with the defeat and capture of Napoleon III, a new republic. Bradlaugh, Odger and all the usual radical suspects supported this new republic immediately, demanding Gladstone recognise it. In fact, Bradlaugh went on the payroll for it. He got money from Tears. That's sort of documented. Gladstone wanted Gladstone to recognise the new republic and perhaps even enter the war on the new republic's side. And there was quite an agitation to join in. When the Commune was set up on March the 18th, 1871, in opposition to both the new French Republic and Prussia, Bradlaugh, Odger and the others continued to support the new French Republic, joining with the bourgeoisie to condemn the Commune. They were delighted when it fell, and ignoring the estimated 20,000 massacred communards, denounced the Commune for its violence. If you remember, the Archbishop of Paris was executed. That was actually a mistake, because it really alienated the Irish, but neither, 20,000 against one Archbishop, you do wonder.
It alienated the French peasantry as well.
It alienated the French. Personally, I think it was a real tactical mistake, but there we are. I don't think you can compare the two, and I would say that all of these anti-socialist radicals who'd been alive at the time were all great supporters of the Orsini bomb plot. So their idea that they were, really opposed to violence is a lot of nonsense. I mean, Bradlaugh ran the Bernard committee, the Simon Bernard committee, and he got the lawyer, and they were very, very involved. And just who was involved in getting the bombs and what have you, Allsop and, all their mates, they were all involved in that at some level. But of course, they didn't object to violence, they objected to socialist violence. Now, as we all know, Marx took the opposite position right in the Civil War in France, where he defended the Commune and denounced the leaders, favoriteers and Ferry of what would become the Third Republic. Marx's pamphlet was published by the IWMA and printed by Edward Truelove, proprietor of 256 High Holborn, where the General Council met. Now, Truelove, radical bookseller and publisher, was another long-standing ally of Bradlaugh's. He was also a Mancinista, giving his son the middle name Mancini, which the guy dropped in later life, absolutely not a Mancinista himself. Truelove was able to give Bradlaugh advance warning of Marx's pamphlet. And Bradlaugh went to work immediately to get Odger and Lucraft, who were apart from Applegarth, were I think the only two really prominent British trade unionists still with the IWMA. And Lucraft had just been elected, he was a new member of the London School Board as well. And so their resignations were a propaganda coup for Bradlaugh's anti-socialist, anti-commune attack. Now, Bradlaugh started attacking Marx personally over the Commune in the July 9th, 1871 National Reformer. But it wasn't until a meeting in December, a meeting at the Hall of Science, December 11th, I think, where Bradlaugh had attacked Marx in a really packed Hall of Science. By this time, the Hall of Science Bradlaugh's Hall of Science had been extended, and it was no longer seated 1,000 people, it seated 1,400. So a packed Hall of Science was very packed indeed. So anyway, after this public denunciation, Marx felt that they had to do something, and he took it on December the 19th to the IW, the General Council. And then there began to be this correspondence in the Eastern Post and in the National Reformer, initially between Lelubis and Hales, and then afterwards finally by Marx. I've got some quotes of it in my little pamphlet here, but I'm not going to do them here because it would take too long. At one point, Bradlaugh challenged Marx to a court of honour. He also challenged Tom Hughes of the Tom Brown's School Days as well. So Marx shares that sort of insult with him. Marx just gave up the correspondence. I mean, it wasn't won by anyone. Bradlaugh's most startling conflicting accusation that Marx was an agent of Bismarck and also an agent of Napoleon III may seem too absurd to need rebuttal. But actually they carried conviction to audiences that did not know Marx or his work and thought Bradlaugh's atheism, republicanism, Malthusianism and demands for peasant proprietorship were actually progressive, and that his call for class collaboration was reasonable. It also beggars belief that Bradlaugh's denunciation of the violence of the Commune should also go unheeded. I've actually mentioned that, blah, 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 blah. The Bradlaugh-Marx conflict over the Commune was actually a propaganda triumph of the anti-socialist radicals in Britain, and it certainly played as much a part in Marx's Engels' decision at the Hague Conference in 1872 to move the General Council to New York. I think as much as the better-known battles of Bakunin, I think these battles with the anti-socialist radicals in Britain merit further research. Anyway, in 1872, radical and trade union anti-socialism in alliance with the great Liberal Party seemed victorious, and socialism seemed routed. As we know, it rose from the ashes, but I don't want to look at that at the moment. There are a couple of new things to be said about it. I only want to look at the anti-socialist radical attempt to scupper the Second International and prevent it not just from being Marxist, but from any kind of socialist body from the outset. So that's quite a big jump. But anyway, I'm sure you're all familiar with the battles which led to there being two separate inaugural congresses at Paris in 1889, the Possibilists and the Marxists. You may be less familiar with the anti-socialist radical attempt to make the congresses meaningless. But before I look at that, I want to highlight something that has fallen even more off the hysterical radar than Bradlaugh and Marx's 1871-72 quarrel. How, after the collapse of the New York General Council of the rump IWMA, Bradlaugh actually tried in 1877 to set up a new radical anti-socialist IWMA with that name in London under his presidency. By that time, Bradlaugh had been working in conjunction with Mrs. Annie Besant for 3 years. There was no ideological split at this time between them. At this point of Besant's volatile life, she was as openly as much an anti-socialist radical as Bradlaugh himself. And it might be also worth pointing out that in 1885, when Besant proclaimed she was now a socialist, she did not break with Bradlaugh, and she continued to talk on National Secular Society platforms until Bradlaugh's death in 1891. Nor did Besant ever repudiate class collaboration, Malthusianism, or the iron law of wages. Some socialist. Bradlaugh was given to setting up organisations. Oh, that's a new paragraph. Bradlaugh was given to setting up organisations and calling himself president. But apart from the National Secular Society, these other leagues and societies usually had a short lifespan. In 1871, Bradlaugh and Odger had attempted to set up a British Republican League, but it had sputtered out a couple of years later. In 1877, Bradlaugh and Annie Besant set up what turned into a successful Malthusian League. Within weeks of this, Bradlaugh set up the new IWMA with himself as president. Bradlaugh wanted to present this new organisation as a continuity IWMA. For this he needed a few ex-IWMAers, but his good friend Odger had died in March that year, and apart from George Howell, who kept a watching brief for Samuel Morley, none of the big-name anti-socialist radicals were interested in joining. They were too focused on finding a liberal constituency willing to adopt them as candidates to even associate themselves with the tainted IWMA name. So Bradlaugh had to turn to lesser name IWMAers, and he invited those he knew for certain or believed had quarrelled with Marx. John Weston joined, so did Herman Jung, Johann Icarius and John Hales. But while Bradlaugh was right in thinking that both Icarius and Hales had fallen out irrevocably with Marx personally, neither Icarius or Hales had quarrelled with Marx's ideas. And like Harriet Law, Icarius and Hales joined Bradlaugh's continuity IWMA as Trojan horses. As soon as they could, December 1877, just 3 months later, they forced a name change from IWMA to the International Labour Union. But the name really mattered to Bradlaugh. And I would argue that without the original IWMA name, Bradlaugh was not interested in the organisation at all, and he tried to get it readopted. He spent the next few months trying to get the IWMA taken back again. But when that failed repeatedly, he waited for a less obviously petulant reason to abandon the project. It came with the Lancashire cotton strike in the summer of 1878, which of course Bradlaugh and Besant, who was also a member of this ILO IWMA, opposed as the cotton workers were trying to buck what Bradlaugh and Besant deemed impossible to buck, the iron law of wages. Bradlaugh supported unions, because it can be very confusing. He supported unions in their friendly society function, but not as militant. And he was very close to the Northumberland miners. Now, the Northumberland miners in the 19th century, as you know, were the least militant. And they were the ones that actually got Lib Lab MPs. And Bradlaugh would go up and he would speak at their galas. And he was very close to the Northumberland mining MPs. Bradlaugh now stopped funding ILO IWMA activities, reporting its meetings, and the continuity IWMA ILO disappeared. Yet it is worth remembering, as Bradlaugh's attempt to set an IWMA shows personal as well as political enmity towards Marx, a sort of insult added to injury, which I suggest not only did not disappear, but was very much part of Annie Besant's mindset. Annie Besant's years with Bradlaugh in the National Secular Society are often ignored, and she's probably best known to you as a Fabian, member of the SDF, and until Louise Raw's excellent debunking of her role in the famous 1888 Matchgirl strike, Besant is also perceived as a strike leader. You might also know her as a member of the London School Board, where she worked most closely with Mrs. Ashton Dilke, who, despite always insisting on using her dead husband's name, was a feminist. But Mrs. Dilke was never more than an advanced liberal, which merged into Fabianism on health and efficiency grounds. But while all sorts of non-socialists could support free school meals, this issue separated Besant from Charles Bradlaugh, as he stayed utterly true to his Malthusianism, and he railed against feeding working-class children as an incentive to working-class overbreeding. Right. Free school means no, I've crossed that out. Mrs. Besant played a pivotal role both in keeping the two separate inaugural congresses of the Second International separate, and she's also played a pivotal role, I will argue, in keeping the Possibilist Congress as moderate and non-socialist as it was possible for it to be. I would even suggest that she attended the Congress as much Bradlaugh's representative as a Fabian, and her main agenda was to prevent the adoption of a statutory 8-hour day and to oppose any suggestion of independent, that is, non-liberal working-class candidates standing at elections, and, if possible, to prevent the setting up of a general council on the lines of the IWMA. We know quite a lot about what she thought because she was also the Pall Mall Gazette's special correspondent at the Possibilist Congress, so we actually get things very much from her point of view. By this time, Bradlaugh was a Liberal MP, Always a maverick, he'd never been backed by Morley, but the story of how he became a Liberal MP and how Gladstone succeeded in preventing Bradlaugh from taking his seat for 6 years belongs somewhere else. By 1889, there were several working-class Liberal MPs, as we know, all apart from Bradlaugh. As far as I know, you may contradict me, trade unionists, and all members of the Parliamentary Committee of the TUC. And in 1889, all of them were intent on preventing a statutory 8-hour day, and all of them were opposed to there being another General Council, a la the First International, as they feared that it might become a platform for socialist ideas. Now, initially, when planning their Paris Congress, page 16, the Possibilists had approached the TUC asking it to send official delegates. And at the Bradford TUC Congress in September 1888 and the London International Trade Union Congress in November 1888, the British TUC Parliamentary Committee said it would send delegates, and not only that, it would circularise Possibilist information material. Yet in the early spring of 1889, just a few months later, when the Possibilists actually sent their publicity material to the TUC for it to be circularised, the Parliamentary Committee thought fit to return these circulars with a curt note. And it was made clear that the TUC would not send an official delegation. A group of militant trade unions set up a trade union protest committee to directly approach unions and union branches in order to drum up delegates and representatives of the Possibilist Congress. According to Reynolds News for April 7, 1889, it had a surprisingly wide membership, including Miss Edith Simcox of the Women's Trade Council, who was actually an anti-socialist close to Annie Besant and Bradlaugh. She was opposed to the statutory limitation of the hours of work, and she sat on Bradlaugh's anti-socialist IWMA. And it is very possible that Edith Simcox went to discover what was being planned, as most of the other members of the Trade Union Protest Committee were socialist, or at least supporters of a statutory 8-hour day. Tom Mann, somebody called R. Newstead, who I would like to know more about, who was a strong supporter of Key Hardy, a compositor. Anyway, as late as May the 12th, 1889, Reynolds newspaper carried a report of the Protest Committee's position, giving its history first. This protest committee has issued a manifesto to the workers of Europe and America against the action of the English Trade Union Parliamentary Committee in withdrawing from the international labour movement in which they have taken part since the Paris Conference of 1883. In a lengthy document, the protest committee set out the reasons for their action, the chief of which are that at the Paris Congress of 1886 it was resolved that the International Workers' Congress should be held in Paris in 1889, and that the members of the Parliamentary Committee present on that occasion raised no objection. At the English Trade Union Congress held at Bradford, the French delegates who were present as visitors invited the French English trade unions to the Paris Congress. At the International Congress held in London, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, the Reynolds article then went on to give its explanation for the TUC leadership's decision to back out of supporting the Possibilist Congress. There is no disguising the fact that the members of the Parliamentary Committee are opposed to internationalism because they see it as a means, the introduction in England of many new ideas, new methods and a new labour policy. This new policy will compel the leaders of the working classes to steer a course independent of all middle-class political parties, which will bring these leaders occasionally at least into conflict with liberals as well as conservatives. In plain English, this meant the protest committee felt the TUC had backed out of sending delegates, as they did not want to risk being outvoted, especially on the issues of fielding independent working class, that is non-liberal candidates, and they did not want to be outvoted on the issue of a statutory 8-hour day. Although the parliamentary committee of the TUC did not send official delegation, they did want their position heard, and as well as Annie Besant, Charles Fenwick, Liberal MP and parliamentary committee member, went as an individual, not as a delegate. He was a Northumberland miners' leader, and it is no accident that Charles Bradlaugh had always had particularly close relations with Northumberland miners. Bradlaugh often took part at their gala, spoke at their galas, and as they were the most non-militant of all the miners' unions. At the Possibilist Congress, Annie Besant worked closely with Fenwick. To fast forward a little, so that Charles Fenwick can be put into context, Fenwick was still an MP when in 1907 the Northumberland Miners' Union voted to affiliate to the Labour Party. Fenwick, together with his colleague Thomas Burt, also of the Northumberland Miners, refused to accept this directive, and at the 1910 general election they were still elected as members of the Liberal Party. And it may come as no surprise to you that both Fenwick and Burt left thousands when they died. At Paris in 1889, Fenwick strenuously argued against the demand for a statutory 8-hour working day, and when he realised it was going to pass regardless, he managed to add the rider that the statutory 8-hour working day could not be instituted by Britain unilaterally, but only by international agreement between the industrial countries. So that was agreed, and it looked like that's throwing it into the long grass. Other British trade unionists also attended either the Possibilist or, in a few cases, the Marxist Congress, but again they attended as individuals or delegates from their branches, not the TUC itself. A little confusingly, some of these trade unionists, Benjamin Cooper, the cigar makers, E. White, the bookbinders, R. Newstead again, claimed to speak on behalf of the TUC, but they were only past and future delegates to TUC congresses, not official representatives. And while they may have been right in insisting they represented the views of TUC members, it still needs to be understood they were not TUC delegates. Having two separate separate congresses. The story of calling of the two separate Congress cannot detain us. I argue elsewhere that much of the obvious responsibility lies with Lafargue and Bruce, but that Aveling also played a part in that decision, and that they operated against Engels' advice. But anyway, putting aside the machinations which resulted in the two separate Congresses, when they both opened on July the 14th, there were immediate calls for a merger, with Liebknecht and Heinemann in the forefront of the demand. And if you remember, Heinemann was with the Possibilists and Liebknecht was with the Marxists, obviously. Merger failed, not on ideology, but on the technicality of the verifying of mandates. But lo and behold, Mrs. Annie Besant not only led the demand for verification, but she also demanded that she should be put in charge of the process. Her own reports in the Pall Mall Gazette are mine of information for this negotiation, some of it inadvertent. To an audience largely oblivious of what lay behind Besant's mania for verification, her arguments seemed logical, and she carried the Possibilist Congress in a speech she admiringly reported herself in the PMG, but which was also admired by the bloated and violently anti-socialist Paris correspondent for the Times, Henry Blautz. Mrs. Besant deserves congratulations on the success of her first speech at the Socialist Congress at Paris. Her energetic harangue last night against admitting the Marxist delegates to the Congress without verifying their credentials was rapturously applauded. Annie Besant was a real crowd puller. As GBS said, she was a goddess. Audiences just worshipped her. When Annie Besant got up on the platform and said a rose was a violet, they all believed it. In demanding verification and herself being made verifier-in-chief meant the merger would have excluded Eleanor Marx and Edward Aveling, and William Morris too, if Annie Besant had so decided, as she was demanding that only national organisations could send delegates to an international organisation. In July 1889, the only socialist organisation Eleanor and Aveling belonged to was the Bloomsbury Socialist Society, though Aveling incidentally was in Paris as a representative of the East Finsbury Radical Club. But this too was too small a body to pass Annie's critical muster. By 1889, Liebknecht would not have cared if Annie Besant had guillotined Aveling and thrown his headless body into the River Seine, but he was not going to allow the daughter of Karl Marx to be publicly insulted by the appalling Mother Besant. There was no merger. And now I come to the decisions. Oh, I've made this a bit dark. In the end, the two Congresses are generally said to have both come to more or less the same decisions. They both agreed to campaign for peaceful resolutions of international conflicts, and more concretely to fight for a statutory 8-hour working day and to establish an annual working class demonstration to be held throughout the world, ideally on May 1st, blah, blah. In the PMG, Annie Besant gave a slightly different assessment of what the Possibilists rather than the Marxist Congress had agreed. First of all, she was particularly pleased that there was no agreement to follow the First International's example and set up a central or general council. This, of course, was arguably a weakness, but as weakness of the international body was the agenda of anti-socialist radicalism, Annie inevitably saw that as a plus, and so did her allies. If a general council had been set up in 1889, it would logically have been established in Germany, and that in itself is a thought worth pondering. Moving swiftly on, Annie Besant also reported what is often missed, that the Possibilist Congress had only accepted Charles Fenwick's amendment and had only agreed that the 8-hour working day should become statutory if it was fixed by international law and not by individual countries. To be fair to Annie Besant, she also repeated her defeat on one issue. The Possibilists had wanted the abolition of night work, as far as practicable for men and entirely for women and children. Annie Besant had strenuously argued against this as it applied to women, and she was furious to see herself overruled. And what she saw was an essential feminist principle, the right for women to work for low pay until they dropped.
So true.
Yes. We do not object to the abolition of night work as far as is practical, but when the Congress says that night work is to be abolished for women, we dissent absolutely. The prohibition is inconsistent with equal opportunities for women and men. Women cannot enjoy equal opportunities for work as men if they are denied the opportunity of working at night, when such work is necessary and allowed to men. We shall not say more about this just now, but we will later, but merely intimate to all whom it may concern that in the near future women will fight and win a severe battle against the imposition of restrictions which are intended to protect them against oppression, but which in reality extinguish their right to earn their daily bread. She very much opposed, I think it was called Mr. Cross's Act in 1875, when this swine of a Tory wanted to reduce women's working hours to 57.5. She was very opposed to that. But what if women don't earn enough money in 57.5 hours work? I mean, this is, really. By opportunities, we have to remember Annie was referring to all-night hard physical work, not the right to write for the Guardian Women page. Annie Besant's, Annie Besant's, I get funny on Annie Besant. Annie Besant's brand of bourgeois feminism can also be discussed elsewhere, but Charles Fenwick's amendment to make the 8-hour working day statutory by international agreement is interesting, and it caught the attention of Bismarck and Wilhelm II, who called a Congress of Governments to discuss the possibility of a European-wide state-imposed 8-hour day along with other labour issues. The International Labour Congress, initially called for Bern, was held in Berlin in March 1890 for governments. It was hosted by the new young Emperor Wilhelm II, who, as the London Standard reported, had written to the Tory Prime Minister Lord Salisbury on December 8, 1890, suggesting the Congress should discuss the implementation of a statutory 8-hour day in all industrial countries. This is what Prince Bismarck, this was Prince Bismarck writing on the 8th of February to inform Lord Salisbury. The competition of nations in the trade of the world and the community of interest proceeding therefore make it impossible to create successful institutions for the benefit of working men of one country without curtailing that country's power of competing with other countries. Such institutions can only be established on a basis adopted in common with all other countries concerned. Lord Salisbury vetoed this. He specifically only agreed to send a delegation to Berlin headed by Sir John Gorst, provided the issue of a European-wide statutory 8-hour day was not discussed, as Her Majesty's government could not place any direct legislative restrictions upon the liberty of the adult male workmen to work as long as they pleased. 48 hours a day if they wanted to. Wilhelm II could hardly hold the international conference without Britain, and he agreed to Lord Salisbury's conditions. Importantly, so did the Parliamentary Committee of the TUC, still headed by Henry Broadhurst, who, having refused to attend either the Possibilist or Marxist Congress in Paris in 1889, now agreed to go with Sir John Goss' British government delegation to the Bismarck-Wilhelm II Berlin Congress as official representatives of the TUC. And it screams volumes that Broadhurst and Birtwistle, incidentally, would happily go to a government conference on working conditions which excluded discussion of the statutory 8-hour day, but not one organised by workers' organisations which would have the temerity to discuss it. Anyway, time has run out. As we all know, in 1891, the Possibilists and Marxists buried enough of the hatchet to merge for the next Congress held at Brussels. But that was the city, incidentally, the Possibilists had chosen, rather than Zurich, as the Marxists had first wanted. It is perhaps symbolic from the first that anti-socialist radicalism was alive and well in the Second International from the very beginning, with the result we all know. That's it.
Very good.